Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and today we're going to talk all about Ironjawz armor. So I'm working on some piggies here for my army, and I've got their armor, the larger armor pieces that can be taken off, separated as a sub-assembly. So this is the back of the orc's armor and the side plates on the pig. And I thought it'd be a fun chance to walk you through how I do Ironjawz armor. Ironjawz armor is fantastic. It's really a wonderful thing to paint, because unlike, say, doing Stormcast armor, which is just very smooth and rounded and kind of flat and boring, or something like Chaos armor, which is very ornate and has lots of sort of embossed or sunken in details, etc. Ironjawz armor is very flat, but it has these wonderful ridges throughout it. It has this rougher feel to it. And because they're orcs, you know, they don't take great care of it, so it gives us a great chance to play with things like weathering, with scratching and texturing on the metal, all sorts of good opportunities. So, we started out here with a little zenithal. That's all that was done. Now you'll notice I didn't necessarily hue directly to this is mostly zenithal, but we have a little bit of directional lighting in. Like, for example, here on the side, you can see that, like, certainly it's darker under the ridge here, but, you know, I really pushed the highlight down here toward the edge. Is that exactly, or, you know, same on the back right here. Is this exactly accurate? You know, I mean, that's probably up for some debate, but it's visually interesting. So, and that's what we want to go for. So the first thing we want to do here is, much like if you watch the How to Prepare Your Best Miniature video, we're gonna go ahead and pull out these details, and we're gonna use a fair amount of dry brushing in this tutorial. Now, people tend to be fairly negative about dry brushing, or there's the rumor, you know, there's this sort of thought going around that, like, good artists or good paint jobs don't use dry brushing. That's nonsense. The problem is I see people use dry brushing in the wrong circumstances and in the wrong way. So we're going to talk about how to apply dry brushing and how to apply it well. The colors we're going to be using today are pretty straightforward. We're going to use Scale 75 Huldra Blue, Amhearth Blue, and then our friends' war colors, black and white. Pretty easy. Now, so I've already put some white out on my palette over here off to the side, and I'm just going to get some of that onto my brush in a dry brush fashion. So when I'm dry brushing, first thing I do is get some paint on there and then really wipe it off. Now, first tip about dry brushing: get yourself a big bristled, or a big brush with extremely soft bristles, so I can test there and see how much paint is coming off. And I want very little paint on this, okay? The less paint, the better. That way we don't get drag marks, because that's what we want to avoid. So then we're going to very lightly, and I'm very, very lightly touching this thing, go over it. Now, notice how slowly the paint is building up. A lot of times when I see people dry brush, especially on surfaces like this, they leave a lot of paint on the brush and they push real hard. And what happens is you get those scratches, those drag marks, those chalky effects of the paint. And if you do that, it naturally just looks like a crap job. So don't do that. Whereas if you have a very soft bristled brush and a light touch, and you just kind of repeatedly work it from all the angles, what you get is this emergence of the wonderful edges. Very subtle, very soft, and it just kind of slowly builds it up. And that's what we want. Okay? So we're just going to repeat that on the other one here. So again, I get a new thing of paint. You notice I don't try to do multiple sections. I'm only doing that one section and basically letting my brush completely empty out of paint. And when I go back, I'm going to test again on my hand to make sure I've got the big chunks out and stuff like that. And again, nice soft touch. I'm just slowly rotating the angle so I get this from all the different sides, hit all the various elements of it, and I just want to bring those ridges out. Again, there's nothing complicated about this, right? This is the simplest of processes. I might still have enough to grab that one. We'll kind of sketch this out. The armor on the brutes is beautiful. It's just the best armor because it has these really nice deep ridges that it takes almost no paint on your brush to pick out. So I can be very light with it. I can have almost zero paint left on the brush. And just very slowly build it up. The less dense the sort of contrasting material is, where you have these ridges, the less flat, right? Like these big plates are pretty flat. So I want to keep a very low amount of paint on the brush because I don't want anything going where the ridge isn't grabbing it. So the less of that you have, the more it's bumpy, like if you're doing fur or something, the more paint you can get away with because you'll have less chance of it actually getting down in ridges. The more flat something is, the less paint you have to operate with. And again, very soft bristles, repeated, and there we go. So now you can see we've got those edges all nice and picked out. Okay. There you go. Okay. All right. So our next step is going to take us over into the airbrush booth. So back in a moment. All right, and we're back. So as you can see, we're over at the airbrush booth here. And what we've done is we've taken a 2-to-1 mix of the Huldra and Amarth Blue. Now, as we know from previous videos, when you've got dark blues, greens, purples, colors that have no white in them, they're very transparent. Amarth Blue, because it's this brighter blue, anything like this is going to really have a higher level of coverage. And so we want to stay away from that because we want to use all this stuff that we laid down, all this undershading. So we're going 2 to 1. Okay? We've thinned it way down. Got it loaded up in our airbrush here. And we're going to give it a little test first, of course, as usual. Okay. So you can see that's what we get out of that there. And I feel like that's still just a bit too thick. So I just put in another little drop of thinner. There we go. And we'll just backfill that. Okay. There we go. We got a nice good coverage going now. Nice and thin, we're basically glazing over top of this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to very gently lay down a nice thin glaze of the blue. You'll notice we can still see the darks, the lights. We can still see some of our dry brushing poking through there. That's what we want, but it just kind of smooths it all out. It's always better to go thinner than thicker when doing this because it's very quick and easy to put on a second layer with an airbrush, obviously. It takes basically 0 time and effort to do another layer, so you're always better going thinner and then building up rather than going thicker and having it blow away the work you did underneath, okay? So, quick and easy. No issue. All right. Now, I have the rest of my armor here. So, as you can see, just very quick, light coverage. Now, what we're doing here is we're just getting our blue blocked in. Okay? Because we want to get a nice basis of color down. We're letting the undershading do most of the work for us here. So we're getting a ton of good tonal variation without any extra effort, right? And that's what we want. That's why we do all this dry brushing. That's why we do all this pre-work. So that way when we get to here, we're good to go. Now, if you wanted to, you could just stop right here and move on to my next step, okay? So what I'm going to do next, you could just go straight from this to the next level, okay? But of course, you know me, I can't stop after only one thing. So, what we're going to do is we've got our blue. Now I'm going to go in and just in the darker areas, I'm really going to build up the intensity of this color. Make sure I kind of tint some of that black that's still reading kind of black a little more heavily blue. Okay? Alright, so to see it again, like here on the edge of the under edge of the armor, where it still kind of reads black, I go in and lay down a second glaze. Up in this crease right up here. Right? In these little folds. Just make sure we actually get a nice solid blue tint on those. Here under the... up and under the edges. Because we do want this to be blue. Like, we don't want it to be black. And so when we're working with the glazes, the other advantage to them is we can build them up and create natural variation. We haven't changed the paint at all. I'm still working off the same original color. But because the very thin glaze, one coat of it is going to have a different shade than two coats of it, I can create variation without ever changing paint. I can do it just off of my one type of paint. Okay? Alright. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to take some white. Now, in this case, I'll just go ahead and use some Game Air Dead White, because I just need a good airbrush-ready white. And I'm going to mix that in. I'm actually going to go ahead and blow out some of my excess paint here, because I want this to be pretty white-blue. And the more... so we get it down to about that. Okay. The more of the blue I leave in there, the less this will obviously impact. So I'm going to drop about 3 drops of white in, then we drop in another drop of thinner. We'll do 2, because it is a white color, and white is naturally very chalky. And then we'll mix that up. And we'll backfill a little. I've got a little paint stirrer here next to me that I'm kind of mixing it with. Okay. So now what we get is something that looks like this. So there's my original color on my hand. There's my original color on my hand. That's my color now. Not a huge amount of difference, and that's okay. So what I'm going to do now is in a much more careful fashion. I'm going to come in here on these highlights and just kind of build up this color in a few choice places. Now, you notice how this armor has natural ridges. I'm aiming toward the bottom of the ridges. So like here, where this, you can see how each one of these cracks, or whatever you want to say, these raised ridges, creates a, let's say a diamond or a pattern. Toward the bottom of it, I'm going to push this color in. Okay? Now, on the smaller areas, I can't really do that. Like, I can't get an airbrush to be that precise. So I'm just going to kind of focus more on these areas I previously did, and just kind of build up that blue a little. Now, we can still see our previous dry brushing. We can still see all that. We're not destroying any of that good work. Okay? So, one more time. Here, on this lower area here of this armor, just barely rocking that trigger. Like, I know my finger is somewhat in frame, but, like, I'm doing that purposely because I want you to see that, like, I am just barely touching this. You've got a dual action airbrush, use it. So I'm barely pulling any air, and then I'm holding it like a pen with my thumb. So that way I have 2 fingers controlling it. That's one of the best pieces of advice I can give you with your airbrush, is don't just use your index finger. Use 2 fingers. It'll give you better control. So here, like on this helmet piece, it's very obvious, because what I want to do is I want to hit these upper ridges and really build those up. Okay. And what we're doing here is just, again, reinforcing, using those lines from our sketch underneath to create a sort of guide that we're going to follow. Okay? All right. Great. Okay, so now, again, you could stop here. You've got some nice variation. You could go to the next step. We're not going to stop here. So now, again, I'm going to go ahead and blow out most of my paint. And in this case, when I say most of it, I mean I'm going to take it down to being no paint left in there, just leaving like the basically the residue. Okay? Sorry, the angle is very tough. There we go. Just like the residue. Now, I'm going to start by putting in 2 drops of thinner down there into that, just to get the kind of paint off the sides. And then again, I'm going to go 3 drops of white. So now what I'm going to get is something very, 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 very light. So now I'm up to like sort of a sky blue. But we're still operating. I haven't cleaned my airbrush. I haven't dumped the cup yet, right? Okay, so previous 2 colors, new color. Okay? All right. Now, same thing as last time, but even more controlled. So now we're just going to go ahead and build in some of these little areas. We're just going to take them up very quickly in all these spots. Okay? Again, here we're going to work toward the edge, and toward the edge. This just creates some good visual confusion on the armor. Lets us hit those spots. Okay. Same thing here. You can see this is a fast process. Like, I'm explaining all of what I'm doing, so it's taking me a little longer, and I'm being very careful about it. But if I was going at full speed, I mean, this is what, 5-minute process, maybe tops? I mean, it's not a lengthy process. But yet it's going to produce what I think is some really good looking armor. As a side note, I love the face armor on these Ironjawz pigs. I wish they gave you a set where you could just armor up every pig. But sadly they don't. You only get one. You only get one piggy faceplate. Suppose I could order a bunch of extra, maybe for the next unit. Okay, so there we go. Now we've got our hotspots and sort of visual points built in. So we're done over in the airbrush booth. Now we're going to go back to brush, and it's time to spend a lot of time doing some brush work. So I'll see you back at the painting desk. All right, and we're back at the painting desk. So you can see we've got our armor here. We've created some nice tonal variation here. Let's get that out of there so we stop screwing up the frame. So we've got our nice tonal variation, but now we need to bring it back in. That is to say, we've still got these good ridges, and you can see where the undershading from our previous dry brushing still just lightly shows through. And that's what we want. But the fun part about Ironjawz armor is we can push it even farther. So as usual, stop in this process where you feel like you've gotten what you want out of it, pick back up with any other step you want. Most of these are fairly interchangeable. But for now, we're going to go back to some dry brushing. That's right, it's dry brushing part 2. So we're going back to just a straight dead white. And I'm going to once again get my extremely soft bristled brush. And I'm going to once again wipe nearly all of the paint off. Remember, the goal is to have almost no paint on the brush. Okay. And then we're just going to go ahead and very lightly, and you need to be very light here, because we just want to catch those ridges. So we're just rotating our angle around, right? We're just making sure that we're picking it all up. Okay. A little bit more. Wipe, wipe, wipe. Get that paint all out of there nice and good. Test, test, test. We always test. And then we go. And so what I'm doing here is I'm not seeking to restore every line, But what I'm trying to do is focus, especially on these very high center lines. And we're going to use those as a guide in the next step. We're just building them back up a little bit. See that? Now you'll also notice that we're kind of lightening the armor because we just have so little paint that it's lightened up the armor somewhat. Because we just get very small amounts of very smooth paint. And that's because we have very little on the brush and we have a very soft bristled brush. And the combination of those two things actually lets us use our dry brushing to blend. Okay? All right. So, there we go. Done. We've got that step completed. So, I'm going to reset some stuff, and we'll be back with the next step in just a quick moment. Okay, and we're back. So, we've got our armor. Now, originally when I said what colors we were going to use, I mentioned both of the blues, and then black and white. But I haven't really used the black yet. Or really the white, to be honest, other than a tiny little mix in the airbrush. Now it's time to bring both of those in. So what we're going to do here is we're going to work on this part of the armor. Right here, and I'll show you what I'm going to do. I have a little of each of that on my palette. I've got some dark blue, some very dark blue, you know, of that Huldra blue, some black, some white with some flow aid mixed in, because you always want your white to really be flowing, and some Amarth blue. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is get some of this darker color, like that. And you see how we've traced these lines in here? So I'm going to have a nice, thin, flowing glaze paint. And I'm just going to start pushing it up into the tops of each of these areas. Each of these little segments that it's made. Okay. Then quickly void the brush, and we're just going to kind of dab at the end of it to smooth it out. Okay. So now we get something like that. Then I'm going to take some of that blue, a little bit of that nice flowing white, get a really nice light white blue color, leaning more towards white than blue, so probably like, oh, I don't know. Probably 3-to-1, the white to the blue, but I mean, you know, it's all, I don't really measure my ratios, it's just kind of mix it until it looks right. But it looks like something like that. I don't even know if that really shows up. There you go. And then on the opposite side, the lower side, where the light would catch on these, we're going to just pull a little bit down. Okay. Same thing. Then we're just going to void the brush. And we're just going to kind of dab the edge a little bit to soften it up. Okay. So now we get something like that. Then we're going to take a little 50-50 mix of our bright blue and our dark blue. So our Huldra and our Amarth blue, giving us something like that, a nice mid-tone. And we're going to just glaze right in the middle. Just smoothing out the distance between the two. And then again, we void. And we just smooth both edges. Okay? And so what we get now is something that looks like that. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to get a really sharp brush. Okay? We're going to get some of that white. Some of that really nice flowing white. Just pure white. I'm going to get most of it off the brush. Okay? And then very carefully at the highest points here in some of these cracks, I'm just going to trace a very thin line. Not doing everything. Not tracing the whole thing. I'm going to go in and reinforce a couple of them. And so now what I get is something that looks like that. And so what we have here, what we've created, is this wonderful set, this wonderful amount of tonal variation across the surface of the armor. Okay. Sub trick, the same blues I've used, if you really push this contrast, it's a great way to do ice. So there's a fun thing. Now I'm going to repeat this on all the different chunks around here. Now you don't have to necessarily do every one. Like here on the side, now I got my colors out of my palette. So, you know, here I'll probably do a couple of these squares. Push some up in there. Kind of like that. And then I just void the edge a little. Smooth it down. Same thing, we go up to the high. And I'm just going to bring that right down. Void off that brush. And then grab our mid-tone mix. And right in there, we just lay a little bit of that. And there we go. Then we grab our white, wipe off the excess. And here, let's get the top of this shoulder down to there. Let's hit a little spot there. All right. And there we go. And then it's just rinse and repeat, folks, for the rest of this step. So I am going to go ahead and rinse and repeat. I'm going to do this around all the armor plates, and we'll be back. All right, and we're back. So you can see we've got all the armor nice and shaded using that technique, pushing up our shadows, catching our highlights, blending it all in, and then picking out some of the white edges. Now, you can edge highlight here or later. At some point, we're going to do it. I actually wait because when we come back later and do battle damage elements, I'm going to be using white to highlight the edges of the battle damage, so I'll catch it then. If you don't end up doing that later step, because as I said, there are many points you could jump off of this train, you'd want to do that now. So you just literally want to edge highlight the whole thing. We'll cover it later, but just a quick note. So now our next step is the other great part about Ironjawz is that they frequently have freehand on their stuff. They love drawing on their armor. Most of the Ironjawz armor features freehand, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, I hear a lot of people say freehand is hard, and I don't understand that. It's actually quite easy. I think probably the reason people find it hard is because they're missing a very simple thing, which is for freehand, you want to start thin and you want to use paint that flows very well. So here, this is the front of the armor, so we're going to have some speed lines flowing backwards. And I want little flamey things, so I'm just going to rotate a thin line back and forth. Now, the key to doing freehand, especially stuff like this, is you start thin, and then I just work it larger. Okay? So when I want to build it up, I'm just doing it very carefully and just slowly working out the shape of the thing. The other secret is well-flowing paint. So for this, I'm using some Game Effects Rotten White. This is actually a great white for good coverage. And I'm combining it with some Flow Aid and a little bit of FW Acrylic Artists ink, white ink, which is absolutely wonderful. I'll do a full review on that here very soon on the channel. Because that ink has a very high pigmentation and flows incredibly well. And so what that lets me do is I'm just barely touching the brush to the armor, and yet look how well that paint is just wicking right off of there. And at the same time, look at how great it's covering that blue. You know, basically, I'm getting an extremely thin coat, which is what we want, of course. But I'm still getting excellent coverage on it. Okay. So we're going to just do a little freehand flame here. So we kind of vary the size and stuff like that. Keep it fun and loose. I'm not really thinking too deeply about this or planning this out. We're just kind of rolling with it. In the end, one of the great things about doing worky freehand is that if it's not perfect, that's okay. Guess what? They're orcs. You know, they're not exactly artists. So you can have it be a little off, and that's all right. So, but then we can come in. We want to make sure each of these are sharp. As they dry, we make sure that it's nice and covering. White always looks brighter when you initially put it on than when it dries. So you always want to watch your white. But basically, these are naturally very thin coats. And so then I just work my flames here. Okay. Let's see. How's that looking? It's going to sit like that angle. Need a couple more. Okay, so let's do a small one here. And we just squiggle the line. And we can push it out and push it wider that direction. Push it wider that direction. Carry it out. We can just correct it right down just like that. By the way, when I get this white paint on here, it's very thin because of the flow aid and because of the ink, so I always wick off the extra on the back of my thumb first. You don't ever want to have, when you have extremely well-flowing paint, especially stuff with pigment like this, it's very liquidy, it can be easy to have it sort of get out of control and start running kind of crazy around the figure. So the key is you want to wick some of that off first. So I'm wicking it onto a paper towel that's sitting beside me off camera, or onto the back of my thumb, or onto the palette, or whatever. Just, in other words, get rid of the excess paint. Okay. So we just go through and build that up. And now, bada boom, just like that, we've got some nice, simple, freehand, little flamey things on our armor. Now, you might think, well, geez, we spent a lot of time blending that armor, and then we're going to draw over it. Yep, we sure are. And that's okay, because when you're building up stuff like this, like the layers are what makes it real. And we can take this very small. So, for example, here's his left shoulder. We can do the same thing here. Using a very sharp brush, very good flowing paint. And all we're going to do is do our little lines. We're just going to keep it nice and thin. In fact, it's easier on these smaller spaces, because you have less to cover. So very quickly, I can just go like that. Now these are going to end up being flames. And the reason I am doing white first is because I need to reset this back to color neutral before I try to put yellow and orange and red over this. This is a good example of how you want to think about the colors you're going to use. I want orange to be on this. Now, if I just tried to straight paint orange over top of this, it would be an utter nightmare, because what I would get is an awful brown color, and orange has terrible coverage. But because I'm resetting my color back to white first, what I'll get then is extremely fast and easy coverage of the yellow, the orange, and the red. So just like that, And bada boom. We've got our flames. And there we go. So now we got some flames on the shoulder there. And obviously I can just repeat this around. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go ahead and repeat this around all the armor. You don't want to go over the top with this, is what I'll say. Like, you know, when you're doing freehand on like Ironjawz armor, honestly, you can, less is often more. You want it to be an accent. You don't want it to overwhelm. So I'll probably do like maybe one more here off camera, and then we're going to pick up in the next spot where we're going to actually turn this into flame. And I'll show you how I build that, because we're putting, we've created our lines. Now we're going to freehand on top of it. So, back in a moment. All right, and we're back again. So we've got our freehand all done here. Like I said, sometimes less is more. You can see what I did on some of the other pieces, right? Now, we're going to turn these into flames, and to do that, we're going to use 3 colors here. We're going to use some Vallejo Yellow Game ink, some Scale Color Kalahari Orange, and some Model Air Hull Red. A lot of people use red, like bright, fiery red for fire, which is ironic, I suppose. This is like a bloody red. Fire doesn't look good with this color in it, because it doesn't ever really get that super bright red. That's a pretty fast track to making it look fake. Like, I mean, we're talking about freehand drawing a fire, but just as a general lesson, when you're trying to paint fire, I would avoid super bright reds, colors that intense. But we're going to get some of that yellow ink, and the reason I like the ink is because, again, it has a very high pigmentation, but I can control it really easily. And because I've laid down the white first, I can just very easily go over and tint this whole thing yellow. And you can see how instantaneously, one coat, boom, I get a nice, solid, clean yellow. But because we're working with an ink, and this is, this is an area where I'm going to be putting down, think about how many layers of paint have gone here. All of these layers have been hyper thin, right? That's why we work in very, very thin coats. And we build up using these undershades and things like that. That way we can put down, this probably has 8 layers of paint on it right now, easily. But it's still, we haven't covered any detail. It's still hyper thin. And you can see that the way the ink flows, I get a really nice, smooth, easy, quick coverage. And there we go, we've turned it yellow. Just that easy. Again, I'm wicking off the extra on a paper towel, testing on the back of my thumb, because it is ink. And if you have a lot of it, it will just start running like crazy. And you don't want that to happen. You want it very controlled as you apply it. So we just very quickly lay down our yellow. I'm just going to do 2 spots here so you can see what I do next in 2 different spots. So we just get the yellow in there. We're just covering all the white. Now, this is a very bright yellow. By the way, if you don't have the ink, you could use, like, probably the Lamenter's yellow glaze, or any other yellow ink, or maybe even the Cassandra yellow. I think that would be more orange, like the Cassandra yellow shade from GW, but whatever the case, something like that would be fine. So now we're going to get some of that Scale Color orange, and we're going to get it fairly watered down, so you can see right there. That's how well it's flowing. Okay. Then I'm going to flip this over. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the orange up to the top. Directionality is very important when you're doing freehand like this, because where my brush ends is where the paint is naturally going to gather. So wherever I pick my brush up off of this thing, you notice if I do it in the middle, like when I stop right there, there's an extra bit of paint there. We don't want that. We want it to always be smooth. So we're trying to very smoothly run it out. And you notice I'm going down to the edge on the bottom, because I don't want a whole lot of that yellow left in there. I just want a little bit. Just enough that people get the idea of what's going on. Okay. So we keep this orange flowing nice and smooth. And we always want to be trying to end with our brush up top. So the idea here being that I'm getting kind of the edge of it and the tip of it. So even though I'm not painting real fire, like obviously this is just freehand on the side of a piece of armor, you still want to sell the illusion the same as you would if we were doing normal flame. And because it's so thin, when we're putting it on, if we put it over the yellow, you'll notice that I actually get a natural transition just based on how many of the glazes I apply. So again, I didn't have to switch colors or mix colors or anything like that, right? I can create transitions through the mix of the undershade and the number of glazes. So down here toward the bottom, it's still very yellow. Whereas up top, I can get it really, really clearly orange. Right? So there we go. And we'll do it again. Same thing. Actually, I'll probably just go straight to the red, because I don't want to make you watch me do the orange twice. You get the idea. Okay. So now I'll get some of my whole red, and I'm actually going to mix it with just a little bit of my orange, because I want to make sure that's oranged up just a little. Thin that way down. You can see how that's flowing. And this time, I want to be really, really controlled with it. And I want to pick an edge and kind of flow it up the edge and then stop. So we pick an edge and we just kind of trace the edge, and then we pull it out toward the middle as we go up. This does two things. It gives us a nice dark edge to our freehand, but it also gives us this nice illusion of the flame going into this deep brown red, which is actually the red that you tend to see in fire. So it's more of that deeper color. Now, I can go and, sorry about that, I can go and smooth that back out by just getting back into my orange. Didn't clean the brush, so I left a little bit of the red in there. And I can just trace over that a little more. Just a nice thin glaze to kind of even out that transition. Smooth that out. Right? Now I can flip it over and start pulling some of my paint down. And what I'll do here is I'll take some of that same orange, but this time I'm going to go into my yellow ink and mix that with some of the orange paint. So now I have a very yellow orange. And I'm going to take an extremely thin version of that and just drag this all the way down. Okay. And so what we get is a nice, smooth fire transition that goes down there, stays hot on the edge, but goes up to looking very nice and warm and red. If you want to tint anything back yellow, you can take your orange red, or you can take your yellow ink and you can run over everything again and just kind of very carefully color shift it back. So there you go. So this is the next step. I have to go and complete this around all the freehand I've did, what you just saw, or that I've done. So what you just saw me do there, I will repeat over all the rest of this freehand and get that going. And then when we come back, now it's time to, so after we do all this careful blending and all this careful freehand, now it's time to screw it up. When we come back, we're going to put on the battle damage. So back in a moment. All right, and we're back. So all the freehand is done. You can see we've got our flames around everything, all colored in. Now it's time to mess up all our good work. So in this one, we're going to talk about battle damage. And another great part of orc armor, one of the reasons I love it so much, is because it can be scratched and damaged and weathered, and that's appropriate. That's what we would expect. In fact, you can even see where they've molded, the scratches into it. But we're going to take it farther. We're going to use some of the things that they have, but we're going to go to the next level here. And what are we going to do for that? Well, we've got some more Kalahari orange. You'll remember that from before. We have some Secret Weapon brown rust, and we have some Watercolors black, because we want to use all the different kinds of paints. Now, we also are going to hit some of our high blue and white. We'll get to that in just a moment. But for now, let's start with the damage. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to get a nice sharp brush. We're going to start on this piece of armor. And what I'm going to do is take some of the black that's on my palette and mix it with some of the brown. And what I want here is a pretty black brown. Like, I want to get this first one quite dark. But I want a little bit of brown in there because, again, we're communicating the concept that this is rusted, that this is damaged. So what we end up with is something like that. Looks pretty black, but it's got a little bit of a brown tone to it. Now, damage tends to happen on spots of the armor that could get easily scratched. So we want to focus on the high points. And what we're going to do is right near these sort of cracks, we're going to just come in and we're going to start stippling. And the key is we want to be very random with it. We're going to put some lines around. We'll hit these existing lines while we're here that they modeled in nicely. Okay. And we're just going to kind of stipple on some little dots. All right, so we've got little dots, little curly cues, little things like this. Now I'm going to take this existing line and I'm going to build it out more. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a second line right beneath it. And when we're all done, you won't be able to tell the difference, hopefully, between the painted one and the not painted one. And that's the idea of the thing, is that we get them to be of equivalent intensity. Then I'm going to go ahead and kind of push some paint around the sides of it. We're going to do some littler scratches and dots. Now this side's our freehand, right? Now this is on the back. This thing is coming forward. Like, this is the front of the armor. So I'm going to do a second scratch right there, but very small. One right there, but very small. And then over here on the back, I want to put a nice solid line through the armor, or through the freehand, because yes, we spent a lot of time doing this freehand, but you know what makes it look better? When it actually looks like it's real. And nothing makes it look more real than messing it up. So we're going to follow a couple of these cracks and just put some little stipples and stuff like that around. The key is you want to be very random with it. You want different size dots. You don't want to be at all... you don't want to be, like, planned with it. The more you make it look like it's a pattern, the less real it will look. Okay? Because damage should happen very randomly, very organically. So, now we've got all those nice little markings all over the place. Now I'm going to take some of my brown alone, some of the brown rust. And what I'm going to do is, in these spots, I'm just going to start stippling it in. Not all of them, just some of them. Little stipples, little drags. I realize there's a lot more scratches down there. I'll get those afterward. Just little bits. So now we've got just a little bit of brown in there. Probably doesn't show too well on camera, but it's there. You can also just put a few spots of the brown itself around if you want, because as the paint gets chewed through, it might just have a couple of rust spots as well that are just brown, and that's fine. You can use it to smooth out or reinforce any of the black. Okay. All right, next up, we grab some of our orange. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to inside here just stipple some very small orange dots. And on the edges like this, we're going to drag that rust right toward the edge where it would gather. So we're just placing those orange dots. See if I can get that to show. Now, you can use different colors of orange for this. In this case, I'm using a rather muted orange, so it doesn't show incredibly overwhelmingly. But you can use any orange you want for this. You could use a bright orange if you want to show some real powerful rust. That would be fine too. You want to focus it toward the edges and stuff like that. Very quickly here, we're going to go ahead and finish out the other damage points. You can see that the modeler, or the sculptor, knew that this was the front of the armor because they purposefully have most of these scratches as though they were coming in from that direction. Okay. Okay. And then we can go ahead and a little touch of brown on some of those just to reinforce them in. Again, doesn't have to be all of them. Isn't all the spaces, just quick touches to create some more depth to it. And then little touches of orange, focusing especially on the edges where they would naturally be the most exposed and rust the quickest. Okay. Now comes the magic part. You remember I talked about the white. So we're going to take some of that white and we're going to mix it with just the tiniest hint of our blue. And we're doing that because we want it to look a little bit like it's our highlight color. Now, some people use the actual highlight color from the armor to do this. I don't like how much that stands out. I like it to stand out a little more. Your mileage may vary. So now what we're going to do is very carefully, and this is the tough part, under each of these, we're going to just make little lines or dots or something like that. We're going to find every dot, and on the lower side where the light would catch, we're going to use a very sharp brush. We have paint that's flowing extremely easily off of the brush, and we're just going to go ahead and underline everything very carefully. Okay. This is very careful, detailed work. You need a very steady hand, and you'll see how I've got my wrists locked. It's probably not really showing on camera, but I have my wrists locked like this, and they're resting on the desk. That way I can't move anything except the tips of my fingers. It's good advice for when you need to paint very carefully. You want basically only the tips of your fingers to be able to move. Instead of drawing a full line, you can also just kind of roughly stipple. You can see how I'm like vibrating the brush. That makes the white pattern a little more uneven, which tends to look a little bit more ragged and natural as the bottom of the streak, so you don't have to feel like you're trying to draw an exact line. And it's actually quite a bit easier if you just kind of vibrate along like that. It can really actually help quite a bit. If you have an unsteady hand, just kind of do this. You see how I'm just kind of stabbing? You'll find that that kind of motion, your hand in motion like that, is actually much easier for your body to do and sort of hold than trying to keep it incredibly steady along a line like that. Like, your hand naturally wants to have those muscles do some slightly random things. So why not use that to your advantage? So we catch under each one of these little dots. We'll get them all. Trace all the little dots. the long streaks like this are where you generally want to focus on, like, more solid lines as opposed to stippling dots, but you can do either. It's fine. So like when we look at this, like I could just as easily go with some dots instead of some lines, and it's fine. Okay. So now what we get is that. Right? So now you can see where we've got some nice damage on the armor. Now, maybe that's heavier than you want. Maybe not. Do it as much as you feel is appropriate when it comes to scratches and damage. This is like the outer part of the pig's armor, so I've got to imagine he rams this pig into like everything. So I kind of went heavy on it. Now, one final interesting thing you can do here is you can take just your white, okay, and you can get it flowing real nice on a very sharp brush. And towards the edges, first of all, this is where you'd want to make sure your edge highlight was already in, because you don't want your black over top of that. But we can also come in and just go and make some quick scratches toward the edge. We need them to be like super sharp. I let my paint dry a little too much while I was talking. But basically we come toward the edge and we just make some very light, super quick scratches. And we can kind of pull them down. And it just kind of makes the armor look worn. You can kind of push them around. You don't have to do it anywhere in particular. Just kind of it's going to be touched wherever you feel it's appropriate. Okay? So what you get is a little more wear and tear on the edge there. You can see up top there real nice. Okay, so now we've got these big scratches. And now, like this big rust spot and these things, let's talk about something else neat we can do. So we've got a nice deep scratch right here on this part of the armor. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go take some of my orange paint. Which I want to get flowing rather well here, because I want it to be fairly wet. And I'm just going to draw it down straight out of here. Right out of the center of that. Okay? Then I'm going to avoid my brush, and I'm just going to kind of smooth the edge a little bit. Okay? So what you get is a little bit of an orange stain. Then I'm going to take, you can use an ink for this, or some of your existing paint. I prefer to use an ink for this because, to me, what you want here is I want something very sharp, and an ink is going to naturally generate that, so I prefer to use a little sepia ink for this. But once we've got the orange stain laid down, then we're going to take some of that sepia ink. And again, very carefully, I'm just going to trace my line down like that. And I might smooth it out a little bit, draw it out a little bit. So we just create the image of a rust streak flowing out of there. Again, very simple. Now again, I did it over top of that. You might need to go, like you might have colors that kind of, where you have that crossover, so I might need to come back in and like reinforce my cuts here. And that's fine. There you go. There we get a nice little, you can see how that looks. Nice little streak on the armor where the rust has leaked out and ran over it. This is a particularly great effect if you're doing like white or yellow or something like that. That orange and brown is going to look fantastic over that. It doesn't show as much on the blue, but it's still nice to do. So, with the battle damage complete, the armor is basically done. That's it. That's sort of the final step. All the edges are done in all their steps. I have the white reflections underneath everything where the light catches are. I basically go around at the end and make sure my edges are nice and sharp, So I go around kind of at the end and clean up to make sure all my edges are nice and smooth and highlighted. But basically that's it. You know, I'll come back and do these little extra pieces that are this chain and stuff that's metal. But that's the armor. So there you go. That's Ironjawz armor. I hope that this was informative for you. I hope it was helpful. Obviously, you don't need to do everything I did here. For most people, the prospect of spending the amount of time we've done in this video on the armor of regular troops sounds probably somewhat nightmarish. This is what I'm doing with this army, and I'm doing all of these steps to every troop, no matter what. So, this is a slow army for me. But it's also, like, my 10th army, so, you know. That's not meant to brag. That's just mean to say, like, I can afford to spend some time. I got plenty of crap to play with. But it's something that I hope you can find individual techniques, whether it's the contrast points in the armor, the freehand, right, the damage. All these things can be used to add visual interest to the armor, and I hope you find them valuable. So, oh, my glove is split. I didn't even notice that. There you go. Okay, so, at any rate, I hope this has all been useful to you, and I hope you find some of these techniques that you can apply to your own orcs or other similarly damaged guys. These kind of techniques will also work great on things like Space Marines, especially if you want the scratches and that sort of thing on, like, Nurgle Marines, say Death Guard right now. I use a lot of these same techniques when I did a Death Guard model recently. So, hope you enjoyed this. If you did, give it a like. Subscribe for more hobby cheating in the future. Share this with somebody that you know that might be working on the boyz. That's always appreciated. Sharing is the nicest thing you can do, and I always really, really appreciate that. And as always, we'll see you next time. Have a good one.